Hello and welcome. We are very excited to shift to the next portion of our event today, which will focus on climate change and sustainability. During this time, we'll discuss the new food business models that are fighting climate change. Our panel will again be moderated by Scott Amyx, Managing Partner at Astor Perkins. And Scott will be joined by Paul Shapiro, CEO of Better Meat Company, and Brian Spears, CEO of New Age Meats. Please join me in welcoming Scott, Paul, and Brian. Scott, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Christine. I appreciate that. And Paul and Brian, welcome to the panel. So very excited to have you. So maybe we could start with a quick introduction. If you could introduce yourself and your company, starting with Paul, please.
Well, thanks, Scott, and thanks, Christine. Great to be with you. Good morning to those of you who are in a morning time zone, and good afternoon or evening if you're not. I'm Paul Shapiro. I'm the CEO of the Better Meat Co. I also am a big fan of New Age Meats, so it's a real pleasure and honor to be on with my friend Brian on this panel. But the Better Meat Co. is a food technology startup where we produce ingredients, and we produce them through fermentation. So what we do is essentially take little tiny microscopic fungi, and we feed them potatoes, and within a matter of hours, we convert that product through fermentation into a product that really looks like animal meat. And so just in the same way that a cow eats grass and converts that grass into a steak, our little tiny microscopic fungi convert potatoes into foods that really kind of look like a steak. But rather than taking a year to do it, like with a cow who you have to feed for more than a year before slaughtering her, our little microbes do it in mere hours. And so we are seeking to revolutionize the protein industry by creating the most sustainable, most efficient, and succulent, delicious, high protein meat experience for people without the need to raise and slaughter animals.
Amazing. And Brian, please.
Apologies, I'm going to be moving because it seems my network connection is not very good right there. So my apologies. One moment.
No problem. No problem.
All right. I think this should be better. Okay. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So all right. Situate myself. Thanks very much. I'm Brian Spears, the CEO and founder of. And great to sit on a panel with Paul. We've sat on many panels before, so it's always a pleasure. I actually just saw him last week at the Culture Meat Symposium. And what we do at New Age Meats is we make meat from real animal cells outside the animal. So in our case, we work on pork, and we use pork cells, specifically the cells that deliver the fatty mouthfeel and the animal porky taste, and then we combine those with plant-based meat. So in our case, our first product would be a pork sausage, which we'll be delivering to market around the end of next year.
Well, I'm so excited to have both of you on, and I think maybe a good starting point is you started to kind of both of you get into this, is that when we think about the broad category of plant-based and clean meat, is that I think people are really not very clear, at least in their minds. Perhaps maybe they have had a Impossible Foods hamburger at a restaurant, for instance. But can you give us a kind of broad sweep of the continuum from plant-based to cell-based to what New Age is doing, which is combining even both?
Sure. Yeah. So there are kind of certain approaches to really what we're all trying to do is recreate the meat experience, and to be able to do so in volume to compete with conventional meat, and to do so with as close as possible to positive unit economics. Ideally, in the long run, to very positive unit economics. And so there's the approach of using plants to entirely replicate the experience of eating meat. So Beyond Meat would be the one that's the biggest in this area. And then there are companies like ours who are using some cells of the animal. There's only one company on earth that is to market, and that is Just. And they have a product called Better Meat, which you can go occasionally buy in Singapore. And then there are companies that also use fermentation, precision fermentation. And that can be a variety of approaches. But then I won't, this is more on Paul's side, but all of them are intended to recreate the experience of eating meat, as in what happens when you see and smell and chew on meat, and what happens to your body, and then also the identity of meat. Where does meat go on my plate, in my recipes, in my family, in my culture? So the product that we make should be a replication of the sensory experience, but then also the identity of meat.
I guess one of the things that's kind of interesting is that why are we not seeing more movement towards, let's say, veganism or being vegetarian? Why is it so important for us to find a substitute for meat so that we can achieve some of these sustainability goals?
Scott, it's a great question. So, first, let me just say, I wish that people would be happy to eat rice and bean burritos and lentil soup and hummus. I love those foods. I think that's fantastic. At the same time, we have to just play the cards as they are dealt. And the cards that have been dealt are a pretty bad hand. Meat consumption is on the rise, not the fall. So in places like the United States, meat consumption is going up. But perhaps even more importantly, in places like China and India and Brazil and all the places where it's going to matter the most in the future, meat demand is skyrocketing. So I would love it if people would just be happy to eat plants. That's great. That's what I do, and I'm quite content doing it. However, I don't want to live in the world of should. I want to live in the world of is. And the world that is a world that demands a lot of meat. In fact, not only are the humans on the planet today seeking more meat, but we're going to add another 2 billion people in the next 30 years, presuming no catastrophe happens between now and then. And the planet just isn't getting any bigger. Raising animals for food is a leading cause of climate change, of deforestation, wildlife extinction, and more. And we just don't have another planet to farm. We're not going to be farming Mars. We're not going to be farming the moon. We have one celestial body to farm, and our planet is demanding more and more meat. And so just as Brian said, we need to create the meat experience by divorcing it from animal slaughter. So in the same way that, let's say, when you flick a light switch on in the room, you're seeking the experience of an illuminated room, right? You're not thinking about whether that light is coming from coal or oil or solar or wind. You just want light. Well, most people, when they eat meat, they just want the experience of eating meat. They like they like craving it. They like the satiating effect. They like how it makes them feel. Whatever the reasons are, they're not sitting there thinking, though, oh, I'm so glad that an animal was slaughtered for this. In fact, if they think about an animal, they might prefer that no animal be slaughtered for it at all. And so I think that we can satisfy humanity's meat tooth, so to speak, without raising animals in the same way that we can light our rooms and our homes without the need to use fossil fuels. And that's what companies like New Age Meats and the Better Meat Co. are doing. And as Brian alluded to, there's lots of ways to do this. You can go to the animal kingdom and use cells from animals. You can go to the plant kingdom and use peas and soybeans, or you can go to the fungi kingdom, like what we at the Better Meat Co. are doing, and use microbial fermentation to create a meat experience with very low cost in a very short amount of time. And I think that it's not going to be one of these that will be the winner, just like I think it's not solar or wind or geothermal, but it's going to be some combination of renewable energy to create a fossil fuel-free future. And the same is going to be so with a clean meat future, that it's going to take a lot of different types of approaches and technologies to free ourselves from the factory farming of animals.
I kind of agree with what both of you have said, and I have two kind of quick stories. One is I spoke with the CEO of Honeybee Burgers, which is a fast food chain that specializes in plant-based foods. And one of the things that was interesting to hear from him was he was less concerned about calories or fat content. He was all about the kind of visceral experience, the actual eating experience. If it tastes good, people are going to eat it. In other words, we don't try to get people to become more sustainable and fight climate action through saying, hey, this is good for you or this is good for Earth, but they are consuming it because they're getting the benefit out of it. Similarly, when I was at the Tesla shop, I was talking to a man who was picking up his new car, and he said, I didn't even know what an electric car was, but when I test drove it, it went from 0 to 60 like a rocket, and that's why I bought it. And in some ways, the way we position some of these sustainability types of solutions is really critical to kind of the adoption, broad-based adoption that's going to make a difference. So with that said, what is the market for these kind of alternative meats and clean meats? And is it big enough, and does it justify the kinds of valuation that we're seeing within some of your peers and yourselves?
Go for it, Paul. He's broadly smiling. I'll jump in at the end.
Well, in the case of New Age meats and Better Mika, the valuations are certainly justified. But I'll say this, look, it's a very hot space and there's a lot of investor interest. And frankly, there's more demand than there is supply in terms of the startups in the space. And that's why you're seeing these escalating valuations. But, even if you look at the value of some of the more mature companies in the space, even the ones that have IPO'd, like Beyond Meat and Oatly and so on, they're doing pretty well. Now, they've taken a little bit of a hit recently, but overall speaking, when you look at their multiples of of revenue, they still have pretty good valuations. So I think that this is the future. I think it's not a fad. I think this is definitely the future. And it's kind of like investing in, let's say digital film 25 years ago. It was going to become the dominant paradigm, but not for some time. You had, 30 years ago, probably 99% of photos that were taken were print. Today, it's the opposite. Today, 99% of them are digital for obvious reasons. It's the same experience, right? You're still getting to capture your memory. It's the same thing that you're doing. It's just being done in a way more efficient way. Similarly, with meat, we will be able to have the same experience, that satisfying the meat tooth again, but it's going to be done in a far more efficient way. So I think that, certainly a lot of these companies won't succeed. Most startups fail. At the same time, there are some that are, seeming to have like some type of escape velocity, I think, and making it to market and having really great products and having great partners. And I think those are honestly good bets to make. Just so I realize that from a founder's perspective, of course, people like Brian and I are in a good seat right now, considering the way the market is. But even if it weren't, I would still think, hey, these are good bets to be making.
So the next question I want to ask is, and this kind of gets into some of your secret recipes or IP, is this notion of really helping the listeners and the viewers understand the characteristics of the features. So in other words, the layperson doesn't necessarily think about a particular food and tries to break down all the different attributes, or like a chef or a biologist would. But in your case, in the science of plant-based and the science of cell-based and the combination, there's a lot of complexities, right? So can you talk about what are some of those features, characteristics, and how do you try to meet all those different things so that what you get in final form is what people want?
Sure. So in our case, we do use the animal cells. So in our case, it's a porcine cells, it's a pig. And the reason we use them is really because they deliver the experience. And we know this because we've tested it over and over again. And we're not really religious about any of the ingredients being by themselves special for any reason. So it's not because we don't use animal cells in the product because we really like animal cells. It's because they deliver the experience. And we do a lot of blind taste tests, A/B tests. So we'll do it with the cells, or for instance, pork sausage. We'll do it with the cells and we'll do it without the cells. And we have continuous A/B blind taste tests to determine, yes, this is actually the experience. And these are the characteristics about them. There's a fatty mouthfeel. There's this animal porky taste. There's a texture. There's a bite. There's an aroma. There's a chew. There are all these experiences that you expect from meat. And so we test all of those on an ongoing basis. And so in our case, we use the cells in the amount and to the degree and in the functionality that they have demonstrated that they deliver the value. And in our case, that means that it's actually a very small amount of cells that we've determined deliver a unique value that you can't get from the plant side. So it's kind of our internal mantra that we don't use the animal cells to solve challenges that the plant-based side has already solved. Why would you? It doesn't scale and it's not affordable. So at the end of the day, what you want, number one, is a product which is really good. As we said, taste is the number one factor, but then it's also scalable and affordable so that you can buy it at the places that you want to buy it at the price that you expect. And then also that you look at the label, you look at the nutrition, and you think, yeah, this is what I've come to expect from, in our case, a pork sausage.
And how about you, Paul?
Well, I want to answer your question directly, Scott, but I do want to go back to one thing that you were saying about, marketing not necessarily on sustainability. And you're saying if people like the taste that they'll eat it. And I just want to affirm what you're saying, because it's so important when we think about the reasons why people should choose plant-based or some type of non-animal source of food. The things that come to our minds are things like hey, climate change, animal welfare, your personal health, and so on. However, when you look at the actual factors that cause people to buy the foods that they buy, environment and animal welfare and health are not at the top of the list. Maybe for a small portion of people, health is, but for most people, they're not buying on environment, animal welfare, or health. They're buying on taste, they're buying on cost, and they're buying on convenience. Mm-hmm. And so it's imperative that just like with Tesla creating a better product, as you were alluding to, Scott, we need to create products that are better than meat. Maybe we should have better meat. But I really believe that we need to create something that, yes, it is better for the planet. Yes, it's better for animals. And yes, it's better for our health. But it also needs to compete on taste. It needs to compete on price, because these are the factors that actually motivate people to make the food decisions that they are making. Now, with all that said, to answer your question directly here, at the Better Meat Co., we run constant focus groups to figure out what are the best ways that we can develop products so that our customers can create the most succulent, the most delicious animal-free meat experiences that are out there. We are partnered with Hormel Foods, the major pork company, where they are utilizing our mycoprotein, the protein we're creating through fermentation, to create really great, fantastic animal-free meat products. And the reason why we, as a tiny startup with only 16 employees, can partner with one of the biggest food companies on the planet is because we have so meticulously experimented to see what are the best ways that we can not only control the parameters of our fermentation, but also what to do with the ingredients after they come out of the fermenter. And for us, that means developing products that are not just good enough. They need to actually be better. We want to not just have people say, oh, I can't tell the difference between this and animal meat. We want people to say this is actually better than animal meat. And that's the gold standard. We're not there on every application, but we are there on many. And we were recently named as a semifinalist in the X Prize competition to create chicken breasts without chicken, which is a very technologically difficult thing to do. And so now we're competing for a $15 million cash prize to create the best, most succulent chicken breast that's made without chicken. And the fact that somebody is willing to pay $15 million to try to crack that nut, to try to create a chicken breast without chicken, shows how difficult this is. And we're working on that, and we're making real progress. And we want to do something that could reduce some of the burden that we're placing on chickens around the world by creating something with mycoprotein that would be a lot better than the product that's coming from the bird.
So Paul, I want to stay with you for a little bit longer. Is that, on the plant side, there's been lots of different ingredients, right? Soy to duckweed and many others that's been utilized pretty extensively. Can you elaborate a little bit more extensively around the power of fermentation along with the sugar that's found in potato, as well as the starch and the fiber structure, and how that actually works together to create this unique ingredient?
Sure. So you're absolutely right, Scott. If you look at plant-based meat today, there's essentially 3 ingredients that form the basis as like the star ingredients. You've got soy, you got pea, and you've got wheat. You mentioned duckweed. It's a pretty cool up-and-coming ingredient. I'm not aware of it being used in any of the products yet, but I hope that changes because you need some more diversification from just soy, pea, and wheat. However, that's really the dominant players are pea, soy, and wheat in the plant-based meat space. What we at the Better Meat Co. are doing are offering a 4th ingredient, mycelium or mycoprotein. And essentially what our microbes are experts at doing is converting starchy foods into high protein foods. So we can take a sugary, starchy substance like a potato, which has about 1% protein by dry weight, and within hours convert it to a food that has about 45% protein by dry weight. It seems like magic, I understand, but it's not magic. It's just science. It's the science of fermentation. So fermentation has the power to create something new from something else. So for example, to use a more common analogy, so if you think about beer brewing, you would take a brewer's yeast, which is just a microbe, and you feed it sugar and it produces alcohol. So you're essentially using the yeast as a factory to take sugar and convert it into alcohol. Well, we're doing something similar. We're not using a yeast. We use different types of microscopic fungi, although yeast are fungi, by the way. But what we do is we take potatoes and we convert them into a product that really looks like animal meat, except instead of having the nutritional profile of animal meat, not only does it have no cholesterol and no saturated fat, it has more protein than eggs, more iron than beef, more fiber than oats, more potassium than bananas, and unlike any plant foods out there, it naturally contains vitamin B12 because it is a product of microbial fermentation. Usually we associate vitamin B12 just with animal foods, but our product, our mycoprotein, naturally contains vitamin B12. We're not supplementing it with it, it just produces it on its own. So the power of fermentation is real. And you can see how entire industries get founded, not just alcohol, but it's how we make our bread rise. We take a different type of yeast, a baker's yeast, and instead of producing alcohol, when you feed it sugar, that produces CO2 and it leavens your bread and you get a loaf of bread rather than a thin cracker. Well, we just have different types of microbes. They're not genetically modified, they're wild harvested natural strains, but instead of producing CO2 or instead of producing alcohol, what we're producing is a very meat-like food that we call rhiza, which I think is going to be the fourth component. Pea, wheat, and soy, and then these makers of the alternative meats are going to also want mycelium because it is so much more meat-like than extruded plant protein isolates.
And I think what's interesting is that when you're trying to create a texture like, let's say, chicken versus pork versus beef versus aqua or fish, is using the different types of microbials in combinations and different fermentation process to get to the end result. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you can control parameters of the fermentation to get different types of textures, but it's really easier to actually modify it post-fermentation. So there's all different types of ways that you can process the mycoprotein to create different textures once it's out of the fermenter. So from our perspective, it's probably just technologically easier to produce one fermentation product and then let our product application specialists do their thing and create the novel types of meats, whether it's crab or chicken, fish, beef, etc.
Amazing. I want to go back to Brian. Brian, I think in the cell meats, the ones that are grown in a lab environment, the things that they struggle with is everything from, of course, the fatty component to the muscle. And if it's a muscle, it's the layering of the muscle tissue and the direction and, of course, the structure that provides that volume. So there's a lot of things to worry about and work out. In your case, you're taking the best and the lowest cost options from the plant-based and then layering in this, porky, oily feel on the mouth, all these characteristics that you can only get from the fat cells of the pork. How are you guys able to replicate that? Or is it because it's coming in the form of like a sausage, you don't have to worry about the kinds of marbling or the tissue, like, let's say, a steak form, for instance?
Correct. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons we went with a ground product in the first place. It's a massive market in the forms of pork sausage, pork dumplings, about $80 billion worldwide. And you're correct. You don't have to solve the tissue replication aspect to try to get that whole cut, as you mentioned there, the layering of the fat in the muscle. We think it's interesting, the companies who have taken that approach. Though if you ask any of them, they'll note that they can make a very low volume, a very high cost product, which doesn't really mirror the market. And possibly in the future it will, but for right now, it's very difficult. So in our case, what we're really trying to replicate is the sensory experience, the texture of pork sausage. So there's a characteristic bite, snap, bounce, chew that you're going to get from that. And so the plant ingredients actually shine in a lot of those cases. And as you note, the fat component that we add, we actually mix that with plant fat. So the coconut fat, that, for instance, that you would expect, and in a certain way that then, if you will, extends the experience that you would get from the pork cells. So in which case, the pork, you can use a very small amount of the pork cells, which again, I'm bringing that up because that makes our unit economics very good and scalable and much more scalable.
Absolutely. And Brian, just on a personal level, I certainly hope that you guys come up with a chicken product for those of us that don't eat pork. And any potential news there?
So we definitely do look at other species. The chicken market is interesting, though kind of one of the reasons that we went with pork in the first place is it's the most consumed animal on earth. Mm-hmm. But then also a small amount of pork taste goes a long way. So one of the reasons that you may sprinkle bacon bits on your salad. Whereas if you, especially in the Western market, to say something tastes like chicken is kind of an epithet. It doesn't really have much of a taste. And so to go use our process to go and create something that people don't really value, it's not the first product that we're going to target.
Absolutely. No, I completely understand what you're saying. I know we're running out a little bit of time here. Can both of you talk about where you guys are as a company in terms of both the capitalization, maybe revenue magnitudes, as well as kind of the next stage of the company lifecycle.
Sure.
Sure.
Let's see which
Oh,
one.
no. It's all you. You go first, Brian.
I'll go first because Paul's going to be better because he actually has revenue. We're still a pre-revenue company. We are moving to market, as I said, next year. We've raised about 32 million total, and production and the Series A that we just closed a few months ago will be taking us to market, as I said, next year by actually building a production facility.
Cool. So Scott, the Better Meat Co. is still a small company. We have 16 employees, but we're a small company that's doing big things. We have built and are operating the largest mycoprotein fermentation biomass facility anywhere in the world outside of Corn, which is QUORN, the company Corn in the UK. So we're running the largest fermentation facility for mycelium biomass in North America. We're partnered with companies like Purdue Farms and Hormel Foods, which are buyers of ours. And we have to date raised about $27 million. And we're going to be going out and raising a lot more money in the next month or two. So if folks are interested in partnering with us to create a fermentation fueled, more sustainable, tastier food future, we'd welcome hearing from you at bettermeat.co. Again, that's bettermeat.co.
Well, certainly as we convert to hybrid and in-person events starting hopefully next year, we certainly would love to be able to have some taste tests. It's been a real pleasure, and I want to hand it over back to Christine.
Thank you.
Oh, that all sounds delicious. I'm Italian. I grew up on pork and sausage and brujol, so I would love to be able to lower my cholesterol and still enjoy the food that I love.
Christine, come on over to Sacramento. We will give you the most delicious mycelium-based steak you've ever had. I presume it'll be the only one you've ever had, but I promise it'll be the most delicious as well.
Okay, that's a date. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Scott, for asking such meaningful questions and framing things in a way that we can all understand. And to our audience, please don't forget to give us your feedback in your Eventbrite email. You will see a link asking for your feedback, and we really welcome that, especially on what you heard today from Better Meat Company and New Age Meats. So that's it for this session. Please join us for our next session.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Scott.